Wonderful to see you all here this morning. Bienvenue à tous pour être ici avec nous dans la salle et en ligne aussi. Moi, je m'appelle Mike Morrice, je suis député de Kitchener Centre. Je suis heureux d'être joindre aujourd'hui par Monique Posé, la députée de Repentigny de la Bloc québécois. Wonderful to see you all here this morning. Thank you for joining us. I'll start by sharing the words of the UN Secretary General. Quote, "We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. We are in the fight of our lives and we are losing, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. The global climate fight will be won or lost in this crucial decade on our watch." Now, we need to look no further if we look at the reality of the climate crisis on our doorstep than this past wildfire season. Over 184,000 square kilometers were burned. 5% of the total forests in Canada burned this past year alone. And even just yesterday, it seems like every day there's another report coming out. Just yesterday now, 200 medical journals from around the world are now urging the World Health Organization to deem both climate change and biodiversity loss a global health emergency. Now, in the midst of all this, the oil and gas industry across the country continues to rake in record-breaking profits. In fact, just the top 5 oil and gas companies operating in Canada last year alone made over $38 billion in profits. How are they doing it? By gouging Canadians at the pump. While some will talk about increases in the carbon tax, let's be clear. The carbon tax went up 2 cents per liter in the last year. Meanwhile, profits of oil and gas companies last year alone went up 18 cents a liter. And it's by gouging Canadians that these companies are making record-breaking profits. And it's this reason why I've introduced Motion 92, which specifically says, let's simply approach oil and gas companies the same way the federal government already has banks and life insurance companies in the midst of the pandemic, and that is introducing a windfall profit tax on their excess profits, recognizing that Canadians are also in an affordability crisis and that we could offer reasonable solutions to both address the climate crisis and affordability. And so in Motion 92, we've simply called for the federal government to take this windfall profit tax, they call it the Canada Recovery Dividend, and to apply that same one-time, the Canada Recovery Dividend is a 15% one-time tax on excess profits above $1 billion. We're now saying let's apply that to oil and gas. This morning, about a half hour ago, the Parliamentary Budget Officers now put out their report where they've now costed out this motion. And for the first time, we now know how much would be generated for proven climate solutions by doing so. And that amount is $4.2 billion that would be generated by simply applying the exact same measure that this government has already applied to banks and life insurance companies and applying it to the oil and gas industry. Those are dollars that we could use to invest in proven climate solutions. Just one example I'll share with you. If we were to offer Canadians across the country no cost home retrofits and heating electrification, including heat pumps, for example, the Green Budget Coalition is saying that would cost $20 billion over 5 years. Well, that's pretty similar to the amount that could be raised through the Canada Recovery Dividend. We know there are proven climate solutions to invest in. We know we need to be going further and faster. This would be one simple, efficient, and effective measure to begin to increase the funds available to invest in proven climate solutions. With that, avec ça, je tournerai à mon collègue, encore la députée de Repentigny, Monique Posé de la Bloc québécois, et elle partagera sa commentaire aussi. Merci.
Merci. Alors, merci beaucoup à M. Morrice d'avoir introduit cette motion et de pouvoir vous en parler aujourd'hui. Merci de votre présence. Écoutez, les compagnies pétrolières, on l'a vu, ont fait des milliards, mais j'aimerais juste vous ramener 3 ans en arrière, 2020, où, par exemple, Total Energy ou Shell avaient dit que oui, ils étaient pour réinvestir dans les énergies renouvelables et atteindre la carboneutralité pour 2050. Aux États-Unis, Exxon et Chevron, eux autres, ils avaient dit exactement le contraire. On nie la crise climatique et on va continuer de faire des profits. Qu'en est-il 3 ans plus tard? Les compagnies pétrolières ont reculé très doucement. Ça n'a presque pas été soulevé, mais elles ont reculé dans leurs engagements et maintenant, ce qui compte, c'est le profit. Alors, on va se retrouver sur une planète avec biodiversité qui est absolument là, atteinte, la crise climatique, des crises de tout ordre, parce que les compagnies pétrolières préfèrent la rentabilité avec toujours le même argument. Hein? Ah, ben le monde en veut du pétrole. Ben oui, tu sais, c'est le monde en veut veut dire ils ont, eux autres, des objectifs qu'ils doivent atteindre. Les politiciens doivent être forts, doivent se tenir debout et doivent exiger des comptes et exiger que les compagnies investissent plus dans les énergies renouvelables. Je reviens à la motion et je vous amène surtout sur le dernier BI, et on dit de réaffecter les recettes ainsi réalisées pour soutenir des solutions déjà éprouvées. Et donc, on va parler de transport en commun. Donc, on vient aider à contrer la crise climatique, la rénovation d'immeubles, l'écologisation du réseau électrique. Et on pourrait rajouter, parce que ce ne sont que des exemples, ce qui tient beaucoup à cœur au Bloc, là, vous le savez, c'est la question des transferts en santé, dont les transferts qui ont eu lieu il y a à peine 1 an et quelques a mis à peu près tout le monde de mauvaise humeur là, et n'était pas à la hauteur. Donc, il y a plus de 4 milliards de dollars qui peuvent être réinvestis pour des besoins que les citoyennes et les citoyens ont. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle le Bloc québécois appuie cette motion. Merci.
Merci, Monique, encore. Maintenant, right now, we can now switch to questions for folks who have any. Thank you again for being here.
In your conversations with the government, have you received any indication that this is at all something that they would consider including in the fall economic statement?
Might be a better question placed to them. My position is this is one of the most reasonable measures that the federal government could be considering. That, yes, we disagree when it comes to subsidies of fossil fuels. As you know, I've put forward a motion to end all subsidies to fossil fuels, and they're still bean counting which ones to keep in the midst of a climate crisis. This is even simpler still to say while Canadians are struggling with affordability, the biggest oil and gas companies are making record-breaking profits. Is that not an obvious place to start? It's certainly a conversation I've had with the Minister of Environment. As you know, there are some colleagues in the Liberal Party who have publicly come out with their support. There are also folks like the former Minister of the Environment, Catherine McKenna, who's publicly come out with her support as well. And so certainly looks like something that they're going to consider. Our job is to continue to make the case that this is what Canadians expect them to do, and we're going to continue to put pressure on them to do so.
Can you tell me at all a little bit about what they've said to you, or maybe why they might be reluctant to include something like this?
That's probably a better conversation to be had with them directly. I'm at a loss for a reason of why the federal government wouldn't simply do what they've already done for banks and life insurance companies and apply it to oil and gas.
David Thorne from CBC News. So, for Mr. Morrice and Madame Posé, is this something that you would like to see a measure that the government move forward with in the fall economic statement?
That would seem to be the most obvious place to start, and that would be certainly one of our calls. This could be something. We've done the work already. We've tabled the motion. They've actually applied it to life insurance and bank companies already, and so it's something they could very easily put into the fall economic statement, and that would be one of the obvious places to start. Or the most, if they wanted to move quickly on it, certainly that's one of the conversations I've had with Minister Guilbeault, is to advocate for this to be included in the fall economic statement.
Madame Posé.
Vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
Je suis pas sûre d'avoir compris la question.
Est-ce que vous voulez que ça sera dans la budgétaire de l'automne?
Nous, ce qu'on voudrait, là, c'est que ça agisse au niveau du gouvernement. Alors que enfin les bottines suivent les babines. Practice what you preach, comme on dit en anglais. Et donc, cette motion-là ou tout autre projet de loi qui touche directement la crise climatique, il faut que ce soit adopté, discuté et adopté le plus tôt possible. Je veux dire, on dit qu'on est en urgence climatique. Bien, si c'est une urgence, il faudrait agir et agir le plus rapidement possible.
See. I can imagine we'll probably hear from the organizations that represent the oil and gas companies that we give a lot to the Canadian economy already through paying taxes, through royalty payments, through employment and whatnot. Why should we give more? And if we are asked to give more, this will have an impact on future investments. I guess maybe what would be your response to that?
Well, two sides. One is we're not going to ask. I think that's one of the issues here, is that there is far too many consultations and running to the oil and gas industry and, putting our hands out to them. It's the other way around. They are gouging Canadians at the pumps. They're making record-breaking profits, and those profits are exactly what should be applied to proven climate solutions. And that's the role for the federal government, is to set the rules of the game. And the rules right now are set up in a way that are allowing oil and gas companies to gouge Canadians at the pumps and profiteer ahead of the next generation's safe climate future. And that's not right. And so that's why we're calling for this measure as one of the most reasonable starting points. To the second part of the question, again, this has already been done. We didn't see, banks and life insurance companies dramatically increasing prices when they had the Canada Recovery Dividend applied to them, in part because there's no real cost to pass on. This is simply a 15% tax on the excess profits above and beyond $1 billion. And I think we can all agree that that is excessive, and it's exactly what could be used to fund proven climate solutions.
Est-ce que vous voulez rajouter?
Et j'aimerais rajouter l'argent que les gens doivent mettre pour leur santé. Parce qu'on sait qu'il y a des liens évidents entre la pollution et la santé. Et j'y vais de mémoire, mais je pense que c'est 6 % du PIB qui est consacré à la santé pour des gens qui sont malades prématurément, que ce soit la maladie des reins, que ce soit les maladies pulmonaires. Alors, ça coûte cher, ça aussi, à la société. Et dernièrement, j'ai fait une recherche pour l'œil, la pollution dans l'air, les fines particules de pollution dans l'air qui sont par le CO2, font en sorte que la dégénérescence maculaire va toucher les gens beaucoup plus tôt. La question de la rétine également. Alors, si les gens sont aveugles au changement climatique, bien, les changements climatiques et la pollution vont les rendre aveugles.
These are the same companies who knew about the climate crisis back in the 70s. And as you heard from my colleague, have turned a blind eye to it for decade after decade. It's the role of parliamentarians to step in and ensure that public policy is in the best interest of Canadians, not the largest oil and gas companies in the country.
Any more questions in the room?
Minister Guilbeault is expected to have a press conference today to talk about the next steps on the Impact Assessment Act. What are you hoping to kind of see from that today?
That's a great question from my colleague Elizabeth May, who you might know has written about this extensively in recent days, having been here and herself called for the, at the time when that bill passed, some of the challenges that she saw with the constitutionality, as well as her recommendations for how to improve it. And so if you'd like to speak with her, we'd be happy to set up a conversation. Monique, est-ce que vous voulez parler là-dessus? Oui.
If there's no more questions in the room, we do have one online. It's on Zoom, and it's from Palak Mangat. Please go ahead.
Hi, I just had a question for Mike Morrice. You're billing this as kind of a simple measure. Are you suggesting that this kind of move doesn't need consultations, that the government should it sounds like you're saying that the government could just unilaterally impose this without feedback, because I imagine that that may not go down well at all.
Well, in terms of, like I said earlier, consultations, the oil and gas industry is one that has one of the most numbers of meetings across the federal government of any in environmental defense has been tracking the hundreds and hundreds of meetings that members of the Pathways Alliance have had with the federal government. And so I don't think it's a deep concern that they haven't had enough conversations and consultation. But I think the reality is, when I was at the meeting with grocery chain giants a few months ago, and I asked the question directly to Galen Weston at the time, what his views are on a windfall profit tax on grocery store giants, and one after the other, they all turned around and said how it's just not something that's possible for them. And so I haven't seen an industry before come to the federal government saying, please introduce a windfall profit tax. We're making far too much here. And so I'm not sure how much more consultations we need with them. More appropriately, I think consultations with Canadians about reasonable measures that would tackle the climate crisis head on while recognizing that Canadians are in the midst of an affordability crisis as the cost of housing, food, and gas continues to go up. Those are very important consultations. And we've seen in those consultations that Canadians are calling for the federal government to do more when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. And if we look at one of the most reasonable measures to take, the very industry most responsible for the increased emissions across the country in the midst of a climate crisis is the same industry who is gouging Canadians at the pumps and making record-breaking profits. And so, in my view, it's an entirely reasonable measure to say, shouldn't that same industry, if they're going to make $38 billion in not revenue but profit in 1 year alone, at a time when Canadians need to look at measures to help them retrofit their homes, afford public transit, for example, that it's an entirely reasonable measure for this government to take. And I'm sure there's no shortage of opportunities for the oil and gas industry to have their voices heard on this. My view is that Canadians' voices are far more important.
And just as a follow-up, you're saying that this is an obvious place to start. You just mentioned the grocery sector. Yeah. If this measure is taken up, which sectors do you want it to be expanded to, or do you want it to be expanded in other ways?
Well, again, our proposal this morning, and as is in Motion 92, is simply to say this is actually a measure that this federal government has already taken in the midst of the pandemic when it came to the excess profits of life insurance companies and banks. With this measure, we've now done the research, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer has done the costing to show the revenue that can be generated from the oil and gas industry specifically. In terms of other sectors that could be looked at, I join other colleagues who have similarly called for something similar to be considered for grocery store giants. We don't have the research in front of us for that dollar amount, but certainly when we see any industry gouging Canadians and profiteering at a time when Canadians are hurting, this is a reasonable measure that the federal government can look at introducing. And again, when it comes to the Canada Recovery Dividend, it was even only a one-time measure. One-time measure introduced over the course of 5 years that can be looked at when it comes to the drastic gouging and profiteering of some of the largest oil and gas companies in the country.
Sorry, just to be clear, and maybe to give Andrew some time to get some snaps. Just to be clear, you're calling for a similar windfall tax on grocery stores as well?
The measure this morning is specifically calling on the oil and gas industry. To the question asked about whether it's something that could be applied to grocery store chains and others, the NDP and Greens have mentioned that before. It's something we've raised. But this morning, we're specifically calling on that to be introduced to oil and gas companies, specifically now having the data with respect to, this is the first time we now know how much would be generated by doing so. And so we're specifically calling for this to be applied to the oil and gas industry.
Okay, but you would want something to be looked. Is anyone calling for something to be looked at for the grocery stores or anything like that?
Both Greens and the NDP, and I'll let si Monique veut ajouter pour le Bloc québécois. It's nothing new that Greens and NDP have both called for a similar measure to grocery store chains. Mais si le Bloc veut commenter sur la même mesure, ouais. Ça sera une autre. Ouais.
Okay, if there's no more questions, we will conclude the press conference.
Merci encore. Thank you all for being here and for your questions again. Thank you.
Merci.
Recording stopped.
It's gonna take-